Ronald Joseph Dominique was born on January 9th, 1964 in Thibodaux, Louisiana, into a poor working-class family with 6 children. His childhood was marked by poverty and loneliness, and his school years were a time of constant ridicule and rejection. His classmates teased him for being overweight, having a soft voice, and being shy. Outwardly, Dominique seemed quiet and harmless, but behind this facade lay a deep resentment toward the world around him. His only consolation was music. He sang in the school choir and adored the work of Patti LaBelle. After graduating from high school in 1983, he enrolled at Nicholls State University, but soon dropped out due to poor grades and feelings of alienation. Ronald's adult life was unsuccessful. He got by on odd jobs, lived with relatives, and was repeatedly imprisoned for minor offenses. In 1985, he was arrested for the first time for making harassing phone calls with indecent proposals, and in 1996 he was charged with assaulting a young man. The victim managed to escape, and the case was closed, but this episode was a turning point for Dominic. In prison, he himself became a victim of violence and began to experience intense fear mixed with hatred and shame. He would later say that it was then that he broke down completely. By the end of the 1990s, Dominic was leading a double life. By day, he was an unremarkable technician, calm and polite, and by night, he was a man obsessed with the need to control and humiliate. His victims were young men between the ages of 16 and 46, mostly homeless or people in difficult circumstances. Dominic acted with cold calculation. He offered food, money, lodging, or help, gaining their trust. He then invited them to his trailer where the tragedy unfolded, and the bodies were later found in remote areas of 6 Louisiana parishes. The first victim, 19-year-old David Mitchell, died in July 1997. At the time, the death was considered an accident. Over the following years, the police found more and more bodies, but could not link the crimes together. The victims belonged to socially vulnerable groups, and attention to these cases was minimal. Dominic continued to operate for almost 10 years, remaining above suspicion. It was not until 2005 that FBI investigators noticed similar elements: the location, the method of concealing the bodies, and the circle of potential victims. For the first time, the theory of a serial killer emerged. The breakthrough came in November 2006, when a man named Ricky Wallace reported that a man named Ronald had tried to lure him into his trailer. He managed to get away and gave a detailed description of the suspect. After his arrest, a DNA sample was taken from Dominic, which matched biological traces found on the bodies of 2 victims, Oliver Lee Banks and Manuel Reed. On December 1st, 2006, Dominic was arrested at a homeless shelter. During questioning, he unexpectedly confessed to all 23 murders, describing in detail the circumstances and locations where he had left the bodies. His confessions were striking in their cold-bloodedness. He spoke calmly, without visible emotion. Dominic's motives were simple and terrifying: fear of prison and a desire for control. He claimed that he was afraid of being exposed. "I didn't want to go back there. If they had told the police about me, I would have lost everything." Investigators proved that the crimes were not random. All actions were conscious and deliberate. On September 24, 2008, the court found Ronald Joseph Dominic guilty on all counts. In exchange for his confession, he avoided the death penalty and received 8 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Dominic is currently being held in a Louisiana state prison in Angola. Derek Todd Lee was born on November 5th, 1968 in St. Francisville, Louisiana. His childhood was marked by poverty and family conflict. His father, who suffered from mental illness, left the family, and his mother raised her son alone, displaying strictness and quick temper. From an early age, Derek showed signs of anxiety, hyperactivity, bouts of irritability, and a tendency to spy on others. He did poorly in school, lagged behind in his development, and attended classes for students with special needs. Teachers noted that the boy often lived in his own world, was withdrawn, and felt like an outcast. His IQ, according to various estimates, ranged between 70 and 91, which made learning particularly difficult for him. As a result, he dropped out of school before completing 11th grade. At the age of 19, Lee married Jacqueline "Jackie" Sims, moved to Zachary, and got a job as a pipe fitter. They had 2 children, but soon their relationship began to fall apart. Lee became quick-tempered and controlling, often quarreling with his wife, abusing alcohol, and cheating on her. After another conflict, he was investigated for burglary and spent several years in prison. After his release, he started a new relationship with a woman named Cassandra Green, with whom he had his 3rd child. By the late 1990s, Lee was leading a double life. On the outside, he was an ordinary worker and family man, but on the inside, he was a man obsessed with disturbing fantasies. He followed women, peered into windows, and broke into houses. In 1999, he began stalking a woman named Colette Walker, showing up at her door, offering her rides, and standing outside her window at night. These episodes were a disturbing harbinger of events that would soon shake the entire city of Baton Rouge. Lee's series of crimes began in 1998 and continued for several years. His first known victim was 28-year-old Randy Mabroyer, who disappeared from her own home. Signs of a struggle and blood in the apartment pointed to a violent death, but at the time, the police mistakenly suspected her ex-husband. In September 2001, 41-year-old Gina Wilson Green was found dead. A few months later, 21-year-old student Geraldine DeSoto was killed. And in May 2002, 22-year-old Charlotte Murray Pace was murdered. All 3 women were educated, independent, lived close to each other, and all were attacked in their own homes. In July 2002, Derek Lee attacked 46-year-old Diane Alexander, but the woman miraculously survived. Her son heard her screams and forced the attacker to flee. It was her testimony, her description of the attacker's appearance and car, that later played a decisive role. A few days later, Lee kidnapped and killed 44-year-old Pamela Kinnamore, followed by 23-year-old Trunacia Colomb and 26-year-old Carrie Yoder. The police were unable to establish a connection between the cases. Incorrect profiles and eyewitness testimony pointed to a white man, which led the investigation down the wrong path. Thousands of Baton Rouge residents submitted DNA samples, but to no avail. The breakthrough came when DNA print genomics used genetic data to determine that the perpetrator was African American. This discovery completely changed the course of the investigation. After comparing the data, investigators found a DNA match with samples from Derek Lee, who had previously been arrested for peeping and burglary. When the police tried to take a new sample from him, he disappeared. He hid for several weeks, traveling through Michigan and Illinois, until he was arrested in Atlanta, Georgia, on May 27, 2003. At trial, the defense cited his low IQ and attempted to prove that Lee was not fully aware of his actions. However, experts found him sane and capable of being held responsible for his actions. In 2004, he was found guilty of the murder of Geraldine DeSoto and sentenced to life in prison. Later, in a separate trial, Lee was convicted of the murder of Charlotte Murray Pace and received the death penalty. Sean Vincent Gillis was born on June 24, 1962, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, to Yvonne and Norman Gillis. His father left the family shortly after his son's birth, and the boy was raised by his mother and grandparents. Sean's childhood was marked by loneliness and emotional instability. Neighbors remembered him as a withdrawn child who rarely interacted with his peers and spent hours alone, either watching television or sitting outside watching people. His mother worked several jobs to support the family and often left her son alone. Despite her efforts, the child grew up withdrawn, aloof, and prone to fantasies. As a teenager, Gillis remained inconspicuous to those around him. He was an average student, showed no interest in sports or socializing, and even then had difficulty controlling himself. At the age of 17, he was arrested for the first time for a minor offense, followed by arrests for marijuana possession and drunk driving. These incidents were seen as normal for young people at the time. No one saw him as a threat. According to his neighbors, Sean seemed calm and harmless, a guy who just lived his own life. However, over time, a different, dark world began to form inside him. He began to show an obsessive curiosity about women and an interest in situations involving control and power. His behavior became increasingly disturbing. He would drive around the city at night for long periods of time, following people and photographing random passersby. By his own admission, it was during this period that he had thoughts that later led to a series of crimes. The first murder took place in 1994. The victim was 82-year-old Anne Bryan, an elderly woman who lived alone. This crime was a turning point for Gillis. From that moment on, he couldn't stop. He was inactive for several years, but in 1999, he returned to violence. His next victim, 52-year-old Hardy Schmidt, regularly went jogging in the mornings near her home. Gillis watched her for several weeks before attacking her. After that incident, his crimes became more frequent. He did not choose a specific type of victim. They could be women of different ages and backgrounds, but they all shared vulnerability and trustfulness. Gillis followed the same pattern. He would get to know the women, offer them a ride or help, and then attack them. After the crimes, he would return to the scenes, taking photographs to relive the moment of control. Later, investigators found dozens of digital photos and personal belongings of the victims, which he had kept for years. The last confirmed murder took place in February 2004. The victim was 43-year-old Donna Bennett Johnston. It was this crime that proved fatal for Gillis. At the scene, forensic experts found traces of a rare model of tire. Having established that such wheels were sold in limited quantities, investigators narrowed down the circle of suspects to a few people. Among them was Sean Gillis. DNA matching with material found on the bodies of several victims confirmed his involvement. On April 29, 2004, he was arrested at his home. During a search, police found digital cameras, hard drives, and other evidence confirming his guilt. These findings formed the basis for the indictment, which included several counts of murder. In 2007, Gillis pleaded guilty to one of the cases, and a year later, he stood trial for 3 more murders. The jury found him guilty, but was unable to unanimously support the death penalty, and Sean Gillis was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. After the verdict, he confessed and told about 8 victims, claiming that he acted on an inner impulse and that each crime brought him temporary relief. Investigators noted his calmness and detachment. He spoke about his actions without emotion, as if describing someone else's actions. Today, Sean Vincent Gillis is serving a life sentence in a Louisiana state prison. Vincent Alfred Simmons was born on February 17, 1952, in Avoyelles Parish, Louisiana. He grew up in a poor African-American family and from a young age faced racial discrimination and unemployment, which were typical of the southern United States in the 1960s and 1970s. After school, Simmons worked as a handyman, lived modestly, and had no serious problems with the law. However, in the summer of 1977, his life changed dramatically when he became a defendant in what would later be called one of Louisiana's most controversial trials. In July 1977, 2 14-year-old twin girls, Karen and Sharon Sanders, claimed that they had been subjected to an attempted rape by a black man. A few days later, the police arrested Simmons, although there was no direct evidence of his guilt. The girls identified him a week after the incident when they saw him at the police station. The investigation did not produce any fingerprints, DNA evidence, or witnesses. Despite the weak evidence, the prosecution quickly brought the case to trial. The trial began on September 24, 1977, just 2 months after his arrest. The court-appointed lawyer received the case files a few days before the hearing and did not have time to prepare a full defense. The trial lasted less than a day. The main evidence for the prosecution was the testimony of the victims and their cousin. The jury found Simmons guilty on 2 counts of attempted aggravated rape, and the court sentenced him to 100 years in prison without parole, 2 terms of 50 years each. From the outset, Simmons insisted on his innocence. He claimed that at the time of the alleged crime, he was in a bar and had never seen the girls before. Several witnesses corroborated this alibi, but the court ignored their testimony. In the racially tense atmosphere of Louisiana in the 1970s, the jury was almost entirely made up of white residents, which, according to many researchers, influenced the outcome of the case. After his conviction, Simmons was sent to Angola State Prison in Louisiana, one of the harshest penitentiaries in the United States. He spent his years in prison studying law and persistently seeking a review of his case. In 1993, he was allowed to review the investigation materials for the first time. It then became clear that the medical reports, which had been hidden from the defense, did not confirm the fact of rape. The doctors found no injuries, and one of the girls reported that she was not sure what had happened. This information could have seriously influenced the verdict, but it was not provided to the defense. Since the 1990s, Simmons' story has attracted the attention of human rights activists and journalists. The documentaries The Farm, Life in Angola Prison, and Shadows of Doubt presented him as a victim of a miscarriage of justice and a symbol of racial inequality in the American justice system. The turning point came in 2022, when the Avoyos County prosecutor initiated a review of old cases where procedural rights may have been violated. The review confirmed that evidence that could have influenced the court's decision had indeed been concealed. Moreover, both women who had accused Simmons agreed to support the review. On February 10, 2022, the district judge overturned the conviction, and Vincent Simmons was released after 44 years in prison. Simmons' release was a significant event for the entire Louisiana judicial system. The court recognized that the 1977 trial violated his right to a fair trial. After his release, Simmons himself stated that he was not seeking revenge and only wanted his case to help others achieve justice. Vincent Simmons' story is an example of how a combination of racial prejudice, sloppy investigation, and inadequate legal representation can destroy a person's life. His case highlighted the need to review old convictions and reform criminal justice in the United States. Simmons became a symbol of resilience and belief in the truth, showing that even after decades, justice can prevail. Anthony Bell was born on October 13, 1980, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He spent his childhood in a poor neighborhood where life rarely offered a chance for peace and quiet. He changed schools frequently and grew up to be a hot-tempered and irritable teenager who could not handle criticism well and had difficulty controlling his emotions. At the age of 20, Bell met a young woman named Erica, a kind, energetic girl who, despite the difficulties, believed she could change him. They soon married and had 3 children. On the outside, their family seemed normal. Neighbors saw the children playing in the yard and the couple going to the store or church together. But behind closed doors, the Bell's home was tense. Erica increasingly appeared with bruises and cried as she left to stay with her mother. Neighbors often heard shouting and arguments. It later emerged that Anthony had been violent for years, accusing his wife of infidelity and demanding her complete submission. In 2005, after one of the latest incidents, Erica filed for divorce and obtained a court order prohibiting her husband from approaching her and the children. But Bell was not going to take it lying down. He began stalking Erica, calling her at night, showing up at her mother's house, and making threats. Her relatives said that he seemed to have lost touch with reality, repeating, "If she doesn't come back, no one will live in peace." On Sunday morning, May 21st, 2006, Erica went to the ministry of Jesus Christ Church in Baton Rouge with her mother, Pastor Claudia Brown, her 3 children, and several relatives. Among those present were her grandparents, Leonard and Gloria Howard, as well as her cousins Dolores McGrew and Darlene Savage. The service proceeded calmly. Hymns were sung, people prayed. At that moment, Anthony Bell entered the church. He approached Erica and quietly asked her to talk. The woman refused. Witnesses recalled that she looked frightened. Bell went outside, but returned a few minutes later with a gun in his hands. What happened next took place in a matter of seconds. Shots rang out. Panic broke out in the confined space of the church. Several of Erica's relatives died on the spot. Pastor Claudia Brown was seriously injured but survived. Bell grabbed Erica by the arm, led her out of the building, put her in the car, and drove away with the children. He stopped at a nearby residential complex. An argument ensued between them, during which Bell killed his wife. He did not touch the children. He then called 911 and claimed that Erica had committed suicide. When officers arrived at the scene, they immediately noticed inconsistencies. There were no gunshot wounds on the woman's hands, and the weapon was lying where she could not physically have held it. Anthony Bell was arrested without resistance. The gun used in both crimes was found in his car. The investigation established that all the victims had been killed with the same weapon at close range. The only survivor was Erica's mother, Pastor Claudia Brown. Despite being seriously injured, she managed to call for help and later gave crucial testimony, stating that she had seen Bell shoot her family. At the trial, Anthony denied his guilt. He claimed that Erica started shooting and he was just trying to stop her. However, the results of the examination completely refuted this version. His fingerprints and DNA were found on the weapon, and Erica's hands showed signs of a struggle, indicating that someone had tried to force the gun into her hands. In April 2008, a jury found Anthony Bell guilty of 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. In the fall of that year, the court sentenced him to 5 death sentences and an additional 50 years in prison. Antoinette Renee Frank was born on April 30th, 1971, in Opelousas, Louisiana, into a poor family. From childhood, she was a withdrawn child, craving recognition and dreaming of stability. After school, she decided to become a police officer, believing that the uniform would bring her respect and meaning. In 1993, despite poor psychological test results and doubts about her emotional stability, she was accepted into the New Orleans Police Department. At the time, the city was in dire need of personnel, and the warnings of experts were ignored. Frank's service began calmly, but her colleagues noted her confusion, emotional swings, and frequent mistakes. Her superiors limited themselves to reprimands, unaware that an internal crisis was hidden behind her outward calm. Frank soon met Rogers Lacaze, a young man with ties to criminal circles. Their relationship quickly developed into a close bond, and Lacaze's influence over her grew. He introduced her to dangerous people, drawing her into petty, illegal activities. By early 1995, Antoinette was on the verge of being fired. Financial problems and her dependence on Lacaze pushed her to make desperate decisions. On March 4th, 1995, Frank and Lacaze arrived at the Kim Ann restaurant, where she had once worked as a security guard. She knew that her fellow police officer Ronald Williams was inside, keeping an eye on things. Using her service key, Frank opened the door after closing time. Shots rang out inside, and 3 people, Williams and 2 members of the restaurant owner's family, were killed. Frank left the scene of the crime, but soon returned, pretending she had come in response to a call. She tried to play the role of an investigator, asking questions and pretending to help. However, witnesses recognized her, and her behavior aroused more and more suspicion. Within a few hours, investigators found evidence linking her to the crime and arrested her. During questioning, Frank initially denied her guilt, but under pressure, she admitted that she had been present at the restaurant. She later recanted her statement, claiming that Lacaze had acted without her involvement. The investigation determined that the crime was a premeditated robbery. In September 1995, the trial began. becoming one of the shortest and most high-profile trials in Louisiana history. The hearing lasted less than a day. The jury deliberated for only 22 minutes before finding Frank guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The court sentenced her to death. This case came as a shock to New Orleans. It was the first time a police officer had been tried for triple murder. The public discussed not only the crime itself, but also how a person with obvious psychological problems could have become a police officer in the first place. Against the backdrop of corruption and racial tensions in the 1990s, the Frank case became a symbol of the crisis of confidence in the authorities and the loss of moral values. After the verdict, Frank remained the only woman sentenced to death in Louisiana. During her years in prison, she repeatedly appealed, claiming that she suffered from emotional instability and did not have the opportunity to mount a full defense. Her lawyers pointed to procedural violations and the fact that the verdict was handed down under public pressure. All petitions were rejected for a long time. Soon new suspicions surfaced. In 1993, Frank reported her father missing. Later, a human skull with a bullet hole was found under her house. Investigators suggested that it could be him, but the case was not pursued. The authorities decided that there was no need to investigate the new episode given the existing death sentence. Despite her years in prison, Frank continued to fight for a review. In 2025, a Louisiana court granted her request for a new hearing, giving her a chance to change her fate. Daniel Joseph Blank was born on June 28, 1962 in Louisiana. He grew up in a modest working-class family and showed an interest in technology from an early age, often helping adults repair cars. After school, he got a job as a mechanic and lived a seemingly normal life, quiet, measured, and unremarkable. But behind the outward calm lay a gambling addiction, constant financial difficulties, and a tendency towards sudden mood swings. Over time, it was his debts that pushed him onto the path of crime. In 1996, a series of mysterious attacks and murders of elderly people began in River Parish. All the cases were similar. The criminal acted at night, chose isolated houses, and left with money or valuables. The investigation stalled until investigators turned their attention to a 34-year-old auto mechanic from Saint-Amand, Daniel Blanc. The first victim was Victor Rossi, the 41-year-old owner of the auto repair shop where Blanc worked. On October 27, 1996, Rossi was found dead in his home. There were no signs of forced entry, and money was missing from the safe. The investigation determined that the killer knew the house and its owner well. Blanc later confessed that he committed the crime for money to pay off his gambling debts. A few months later, in March 1997, 58-year-old Barbara Bourgeois was killed in the town of Pauline. The criminal broke into her home at night and attacked her when she woke up. 3 weeks later, a similar incident occurred in Gonzales, at the home of 71-year-old Lillian Phillip. The woman accidentally caught Blank during the robbery, and he attacked her. It was this crime that later became key in his case, for which he received the death penalty. But the series did not end there. On May 9, 1997, Sam and Luella Arcuri, an elderly couple known for their kindness and hospitality, were murdered in La Place. A few days later, Blanc attacked Joan Brock, the wife of his former employer. After a brief altercation in the backyard, he took her life and fled. It was after this crime that the police got on his trail. Blank tried to hide by opening a small auto repair shop in Texas, but he was arrested on November 14, 1997. During interrogation, he confessed to 6 murders and 1 assault, after which the victims miraculously survived. His testimony matched the evidence found at the crime scenes. In 1999, Blank stood trial for the murder of Lillian Phillip. His lawyers claimed that the confession had been coerced, but the jury found him guilty. On September 3, 1999, the court announced its verdict, and on December 9th, Judge John Patavin sentenced him to death. A year later, in a second trial for the murder of Joan Brock, Blanc was again found guilty and received a second death sentence. To avoid another trial, he later pleaded guilty to the murders of Barbara Bourgeois and the R. Curies, for which he was sentenced to multiple life terms without the possibility of parole. In the following years, he filed numerous appeals in an attempt to challenge his death sentence for the murder of Lillian Phillip. In 2016, he was scheduled to be executed on March 14th, but the execution was canceled due to a lack of the necessary drugs to carry out the sentence. In 2023, amid discussions about the future of the death penalty in Louisiana, Daniel Blank became one of 56 prisoners who filed a petition for clemency. The Board of Pardons rejected his application, citing procedural violations. In February 2025, state authorities announced the resumption of executions after a 15-year hiatus. A month later, the first execution in many years was carried out, confirming the return of the death penalty. As of 2025, Daniel Joseph Blank remains on death row in a Louisiana state prison. Nathaniel Robert Code Jr. was born on March 12, 1956 in Louisiana. His early years were marked by instability. His parents separated when he was an infant, and he was raised by his grandfather and great-aunt. Neighbors remembered him as a quiet, withdrawn child, prone to long periods of silence and detachment. Even as a child, he showed signs of inner instability, outbursts of anger, strange habits, and cruelty to animals. He did poorly in school and dropped out after failing 9th grade. Young Nathaniel became increasingly distant from those around him. After leaving school, he went to live with his uncle, Johnny Boyd. In 1971, a conflict arose between them, ending with Boyd shooting his nephew. Despite his serious injuries, Coda survived and managed to tell the police who had shot him. This incident was the first link in a long chain of violence that would subsequently define his life. In 1975, at the age of 19, Coda was arrested for attempted assault and burglary. The court sentenced him to 15 years in prison. In prison, he behaved calmly and avoided conflicts, which allowed him to be released early in January 1984. By this time, his mother had died, and according to acquaintances, this event had a profound effect on his mental state. Returning to Shreveport, Codd tried to start over. He got a job at a construction company and got married, but his work was not going well, and his family life quickly fell apart. Neighbors recalled that he often wandered around at night, appearing detached and irritable, as if he were looking for something or couldn't find his place. It was during this period that a series of crimes began that plunged Shreveport into fear for many years. On August 31st, 1984, the first murder took place, that of a 25-year-old woman named Deborah Ann Ford. At that time, the police were unable to identify the culprit. But a year later, in the summer of 1985, a new crime rocked the city. Several bodies were found in the Cheney-Calvert family home. This became one of the most shocking cases in Louisiana's history. 2 children who were in the house survived, which allowed investigators to obtain key information about the night of the tragedy. The police searched for the criminal for almost 2 years. During this time, the city lived in tension. People locked their doors and guard dogs appeared at every other house. It was not until 1987 that investigators were again confronted with a series of attacks that left no doubt that the same person was behind them. On August 5th, 1987, a new incident occurred at the home of Coda's grandfather. Several people were killed. This time, investigators noticed similarities in the modus operandi of the crimes. Experts soon determined that the fingerprints found at the scene of the Cheney-Calvert family murder matched those of Nathaniel Coda. He was questioned, and although he denied his guilt, there was enough evidence against him. DNA traces, witness testimony, and similarities in the details of the crimes. Cood's arrest came as a surprise even to his loved ones. Colleagues described him as a hot-tempered but seemingly calm man who did not stand out in any unusual way. His ex-wife said that he could be kind and caring, but at the same time, he would suddenly become cold and withdrawn. Coda's trial began in September 1990 and became one of the most high-profile in Louisiana's history. Prosecutors claimed that he acted alone, attacking sleeping people for a sense of power and control. One of the defendant's acquaintances, Oscar Washington, told the court that he had seen him covered in blood that night. The defense attorneys tried to prove that Quito suffered from a mental disorder and was not aware of his actions, but the court did not accept these arguments. After a brief deliberation, the jury unanimously found him guilty and sentenced him to death. Robert Lee Willie was born on January 2, 1958 in Covington, Louisiana, to John Kelton Willie Jr. and Elizabeth Ullman. He had 4 brothers, and their childhood was difficult, marked by poverty, constant quarrels, arrests, and indifference from adults. His father spent most of his life behind bars, and his mother, according to neighbors, was unable to cope with raising her children. Robert dropped out of school in 9th grade and left home at 16. From a young age, he abused alcohol, experimented with drugs, and often got into trouble. Psychologists later noted that he grew up in a world where violence and crime were perceived as normal. His father spent 27 years in prison, first for theft and then for second-degree murder. According to investigators, this influence shaped Robert's twisted view of power and control. The first confirmed murder took place on May 23, 1978. Willie and his cousin Perry Wayne Taylor attacked 19-year-old Dennis Buford Himby during a drug deal. They later confessed that they did it for profit. This crime was the beginning of a series of events that led Willie to lifelong notoriety. On May 28, 1980, a crime shook Louisiana. Willie and his acquaintance Joseph Jesse Vaccaro kidnapped 18-year-old Faith Hathaway, who was returning home from a party. The girl was preparing for military service and dreamed of a military career. The criminals took her to a deserted place in Washington Parish, where they killed her. Her body was found 2 days later in Frick's Cave. The case caused a huge public outcry. The state's residents were shocked and demanded justice. 3 days later, on May 31st, Willie and Vaccaro kidnapped 2 young people, 20-year-old Mark Allen Brewster and his 16-year-old girlfriend Debbie Cuevas. Under threat, they were forced to cross the state line and head to Alabama. Brewster was seriously injured but survived and later testified, confirming the involvement of the criminals. Cuevas was held for several days before being released, and her testimony played a crucial role in solving the case. The police quickly established a connection between the attacks. Within weeks, Willie and Vaccaro were arrested and charged with kidnapping and murder. A federal court found them guilty of kidnapping across state lines and sentenced each to 3 life terms. However, Louisiana authorities insisted on a separate trial for the murder of Faith Hathaway. The 1983 trial became one of the most high-profile in the state's history. Debbie Cuevas gave emotional testimony about her ordeal. Willie behaved provocatively during the hearings, mocking witnesses, smiling ostentatiously, and trying to appear indifferent. This behavior only intensified the jury's animosity. After a brief deliberation, they found him guilty and sentenced him to death. His mother, Elizabeth Ullman, received a year in prison for helping her son hide. Willie's accomplice, Joseph Vaccaro, received a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Willie himself later confessed to other murders, including the deaths of Deputy Sheriff Louis Wagner and several residents of St. Tammany Parish. However, it later became clear that some of the confessions were false. He was trying to get attention and delay the execution of his sentence. After the trial, Willie was placed on the death row in a Louisiana state prison. In 1982, Sister Helen Prejean, a nun from New Orleans, began corresponding with him. She became his spiritual mentor and the first person with whom he spoke openly about his childhood, fears, and regrets. Their meetings and letters formed the basis for the book Dead Man Walking, published in 1993, and later for the 1995 film of the same name, in which Willie served as the prototype for the character played by Sean Penn. Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr. was born on September 1st, 1978 in Louisiana. He spent his childhood in a poor and unstable family. where violence and harsh upbringing were commonplace. His mother often resorted to severe punishment, which left a deep mark on the boy. Despite the difficult conditions, he did well in school, played on the school football team, and was considered a quiet teenager. However, as graduation approached, he began to clash more and more with his classmates and became irritable and withdrawn. After graduating from Kennedy High School in New Orleans, he got a job as a parking attendant in the city center. No one could have imagined that in just a few weeks, he would commit an act that would change his life and the lives of many others. On November 26, 1996, during the evening shift, 18-year-old Hoffman ambushed 28-year-old advertising manager Mary Molly Elliott. At gunpoint, he forced the woman to withdraw money from an ATM and drove her out of New Orleans to St. Tammany Parish. There, tragedy struck. Hoffman took her life and abandoned her car and personal belongings nearby. 2 days later, on Thanksgiving Day, Molly Elliott's body was found by a hunter. Nearby, the police found bank receipts and fingerprints, which allowed them to quickly trace the criminal's route. The key evidence was footage from an ATM camera, which showed a young man next to Elliott, later identified as Jesse Hoffman. He was arrested within a few days and confessed to the crime after questioning. The trial began in the summer of 1998 and attracted a lot of media attention. The defense attorneys argued that Hoffman had not planned the murder and that the shooting was accidental. They cited his difficult childhood, trauma, and emotional instability. The prosecutors insisted that Hoffman's actions were deliberate and cruel. On June 25, 1998, the jury found him guilty of first-degree murder. 2 days later, they unanimously recommended the death penalty. On September 11th of that year, the court upheld the sentence. From that moment on, Hoffman was placed on death row in a Louisiana state prison. Over the next few years, his lawyers filed dozens of appeals, challenging not only the sentence, but also the protocols for carrying out the death penalty. The Louisiana Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court rejected all appeals. In the 2010s, the state suspended executions due to a shortage of drugs for lethal injection. Hoffman participated in class action lawsuits, arguing that the existing methods violated the Eighth Amendment to the Constitution, which prohibits cruel punishment. In 2023, when Governor John Bel Edwards announced his opposition to the death penalty, Hoffman filed a petition for clemency. The Board of Pardons rejected it. But in 2024, the situation changed. New Governor Jeff Landry signed a law allowing the use of nitrogen hypoxia, a method in which death occurs due to a lack of oxygen. Louisiana became the second state in the U.S. to approve this method after Alabama. In February 2025, authorities announced that Jesse Hoffman would be the first person to undergo this method after a 15-year hiatus. Lawyers challenged the decision, arguing that the procedure could cause suffering and was contrary to the religious beliefs of their client, who was a Buddhist. Several courts temporarily suspended the execution, but the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals overturned the ban. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld the decision by a majority of 1 vote. On March 18, 2025, at the age of 46, Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr. was executed at a Louisiana state prison. He declined a last meal and made no final statement. The procedure began at 6:31 p.m., and 19 minutes later, doctors pronounced him dead. John Peter Malveaux was born in 1964 in Opelousas, Louisiana, into a modest working-class family. He had a quiet childhood, serving as an altar boy at the local Catholic church, assisting priests, and rarely getting into trouble. Neighbors remembered Malveaux as a quiet, polite teenager who didn't stand out, but always seemed a little withdrawn. After graduating from high school, he took on odd jobs, got married, and became the father of 6 children. At first glance, it seemed like a normal life, but behind the outward calm, a shadow of inner tension was growing. By the mid-1990s, Malveaux's behavior began to change. He increasingly lashed out at his loved ones, abused alcohol, and gradually distanced himself from his family. After leaving the church and breaking with the religious community, he withdrew into himself, lost his sense of direction, and began to show aggression. By 1996, Malvo was living alone in a trailer on the outskirts of Opelousas. It was then that a series of crimes began that would later send shockwaves through the entire parish of St. Landry. The first known victim was 38-year-old Diana Sam, an acquaintance of Malvo's. After a conflict, he attacked her, and soon the woman was found dead near her home. Initially, the police did not suspect murder, but later the investigation returned to the case, seeing it as the beginning of a series. The next crimes took place in the summer of 1997. In July, 26-year-old Carolyn Nichols was found dead, and a few weeks later, Tamika Wilson, who had come to Louisiana from Baltimore, was also found dead. In both cases, the evidence pointed to the same person. The perpetrator acted calmly, confidently, and tried not to leave any clues. On October 19, 1997, Malvo met another woman at a nightclub and attacked her. He thought his victim was dead, but she miraculously survived and was able to tell the police everything she remembered. This was a turning point in the investigation. The description of the attacker matched the testimony of witnesses in previous cases. Just 10 days later, on October 29th, Malvo met 38-year-old Tammy DePlexon Smith at the Charcoal Lounge bar. He offered her a ride, but instead took her to the rural area of Evangeline Parish. The woman disappeared, and soon her Dodge Dynasty car was reported missing. On November 4th, 1997, patrol officers noticed a car parked on a bridge that matched the description perfectly. A man who identified himself as John Malvo was asleep behind the wheel. A check of the license plate confirmed that it was the missing woman's car. He was arrested on the spot. During questioning, Malvo initially denied guilt, claiming that he had simply found the car. But under the weight of evidence, fingerprints, DNA matches, and witness testimony, he began to confess. Within a few hours, he had confessed to 4 murders and 1 assault. John Peter Malvo's trial began in December 1997. He pleaded guilty to all charges, thereby avoiding the death penalty. The judge sentenced him to 4 life sentences without the possibility of parole, calling Malvo's crimes a chain of inhuman acts committed without reason or remorse. Today, John Peter Malvo is serving his sentence in a Louisiana state prison in West Feliciana Parish. He has not filed any appeals, does not give interviews, and leads a secluded life. According to prison officials, over the years he has become deeply religious, reads a lot, and says he prays for the souls of his victims. Leslie Dale Martin was born on April 24, 1967 in Shreveport, Louisiana. His childhood was difficult, his family often quarreled, and the atmosphere at home was far from peaceful. Even as a young man, Leslie became a withdrawn and quick-tempered teenager, unable to get along with his classmates, and soon dropped out of school. He spent his teenage years among street gangs, where alcohol and illegal substances were part of everyday life. His first serious run-in with the law occurred when he was 17. He was convicted of assault and burglary. The court sentenced him to 10 years in prison. In prison, Leslie often clashed with guards and other inmates, but was eventually granted parole. After his release in 1990, he tried to start over, taking on temporary jobs, but quickly returned to his old habits, drinking, outbursts of anger, and a nomadic lifestyle without a permanent home. In the summer of 1991, Martin met 19-year-old Christina Bergen, a student at McNeese State University. She was outgoing, energetic, and dreamed of becoming a teacher. On June 20th, they met at a local bar. After the bar closed, Christina asked Leslie to drive her home. No one has seen her since. 2 weeks later, police found the girl's body in an abandoned barn near the town of Iowa, Louisiana. The investigation revealed that the last person to see her alive was Leslie Martin. Traces matching the evidence collected at the scene were found on his clothes and in his car. Several acquaintances reported that he had boasted about the details of what had happened. which became a decisive factor in the investigation. Martin's trial began in the spring of 1992 and was closely followed by the press. The prosecution presented a series of evidence, including witness testimony and expert opinions. The defense attorneys insisted that the confession had been obtained under pressure and was not supported by direct evidence. However, the jury unanimously found Leslie Martin guilty of first-degree murder. In May 1992, the court sentenced him to death, noting the exceptional cruelty of the crime and the defendant's lack of remorse. Martin spent the next 10 years on death row at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola. During that time, he filed several appeals, claiming that his trial had been unfair. All appeals were denied. It is also known that he attempted to escape twice, in 1999 and 2002. The first attempt ended during the preparation stage, and the second was uncovered before it could be carried out. Despite appeals from human rights organizations opposed to the death penalty, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld the sentence in 2002. The execution was scheduled for February 8th, but was halted half an hour before the scheduled time to consider a final appeal. When that appeal was rejected, a new date was set for May 10, 2002. At 8:16 p.m., his death was officially confirmed. Gerald James Bourdillon was born on February 19, 1962 in Louisiana. He grew up in a dysfunctional family. Withdrawn and isolated from his peers, he often struggled with school and socializing. Teachers and psychologists noted signs of antisocial personality disorder and a tendency toward violent impulses. Although his intelligence was within the normal range, he understood perfectly well what he was doing and where it would lead. As a teenager, Bourdillon's behavior became increasingly unpredictable. As a result, his mother was forced to take her son out of school at the insistence of the administration. By the early 1980s, he already had a tendency toward aggression and law-breaking. In March 1982, Bourdillon was convicted of assault and sentenced to 10 years in prison. After his release, he did not change his behavior. In 1990, he was arrested again for kidnapping and violent acts, and the court sentenced him to 20 years. These crimes established his reputation as a repeat offender incapable of living a normal life in society. Nevertheless, after his parole in 2000, Bourdillon tried to start over. He got a job, met a woman named Jennifer Koch, and soon married her. In the summer of 2001, they moved to Mississippi, where they settled in a small trailer. But their peaceful life did not last long. According to the investigation, Bourdillon began to show inappropriate interest in Jennifer's daughters from her first marriage. After complaining to Child Protective Services, the woman took the children and moved back to Louisiana. The couple broke up, but Bourdillon could not let go of the situation. On November 15, 2002, 12-year-old Courtney LeBlanc, Bourdillon's stepdaughter, disappeared. Initially, the police considered the possibility of her running away, but soon the investigators' attention focused on her stepfather. During questioning, Bourdillon behaved nervously and inconsistently, and then confessed to kidnapping the girl. A few days later, he indicated the location of the body. This tragedy shook Louisiana. A convicted criminal, recently released on parole, had committed another serious crime. The public was outraged. How could a man with such a past be free? The authorities were harshly criticized, and the Bourdillon case became a symbol of systemic errors in the state's criminal policy. The trial began in the summer of 2006. The prosecution presented compelling evidence, a confession, forensic results, and the circumstances of the crime. On June 29, 2006, the court found Gerald Bourdillon guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced him to death. Unlike most prisoners, Bourdillon did not resist the procedures and cooperated with the authorities in preparing for his execution. He wrote a letter to his victim's family asking for forgiveness, although Courtney's relatives said they did not believe he was sincere. His ex-wife Jennifer Koch also stood trial and was found guilty of negligence and sentenced to 5 years probation. Gerald James Bourdillon was executed on January 7, 2010, at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in West Feliciana Parish. He was the first person to be executed in the state after an 8-year hiatus, and the first to voluntarily waive all legal rights to appeal. Before his death, Bourdillon was granted the right to a last meal: fried fish with crawfish, a peanut butter and apple jelly sandwich, and chocolate chip cookies. In his final statement, he expressed regret and asked for forgiveness from both families. At 6:32 p.m., his death was officially confirmed. Todd Calvin Vessinger was born on November 28, 1967 in Louisiana. He spent his childhood and youth in an ordinary working-class family, but from an early age, he was withdrawn and had difficulty communicating. After school, he did not pursue higher education and held several low-paying jobs, working as a waiter, a loader, and a dishwasher. Vessinger did not have a permanent place of residence and often experienced financial difficulties, which, combined with emotional instability, eventually led to tragic consequences. In the early 1990s, Vessinger got a job as a dishwasher at a restaurant in Baton Rouge. His coworkers described him as a quiet but quick-tempered person who could go from irritation to aggression over the smallest things. After several disciplinary violations, he was fired, which was a big blow to his self-esteem. Unemployment, resentment, and inner tension quickly turned into an obsession with revenge. On November 19, 1995, Vessinger returned to the same restaurant where he had previously worked. According to eyewitnesses, he arrived on a bicycle, armed with a .380 caliber pistol. Inside were several employees: the manager, bartender, cook, and dishwasher. At first, there were no signs of trouble, but after a few minutes, he opened fire. 2 employees were killed in the attack: Stephanie Gazzardo, the manager, and David Brackwell, the cook. Bartender Mike Armentor was seriously injured but survived thanks to prompt medical attention. After the attack, Vessinger took about $7,000 from the cash register and fled on a bicycle. The police launched a large-scale search. 9 days later, on November 28, 1995, he was arrested in Garland, Texas. He did not resist arrest and was soon extradited to Louisiana. The investigation established that the crime was not random. Vessinger had prepared in advance and acted in cold blood. The East Baton Rouge Parish District Attorney's Office charged him with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The trial began in the summer of 1997 and lasted only 2 days. The evidence was overwhelming. Surviving witnesses positively identified Vessinger, and fingerprints found at the crime scene matched his. On June 24, 1997, the jury found him guilty, and on June 26, they recommended the death penalty. On September 17, 1997, the judge approved the final decision: 2 death sentences. In the following years, the defense repeatedly attempted to challenge the verdict. In 1999, the Louisiana Supreme Court rejected the first appeal, and in 2003, the court denied a new trial. In 2012, he was given an execution date, but the sentence was suspended due to another appeal. In 2015, a federal judge temporarily overturned the death sentence, stating that the lawyer had failed to present mitigating circumstances, information about childhood brain injuries, and episodes of domestic violence. However, in 2017, the U.S. Court of Appeals reinstated the sentence, and a year later, the Supreme Court finally upheld it. Vessinger's story has repeatedly been the subject of public debate about the death penalty in Louisiana. The relatives of one of the victims, Stephanie Gazzardo, actively participated in the discussions, arguing in favor of carrying out the sentence. Her father became one of the most prominent advocates for retaining the death penalty, arguing that the families of the victims have a right to justice. In 2023, Vessinger's lawyers filed a petition for clemency, citing his mental state and his long stay on death row. On November 27, 2023, the Louisiana Board of Pardons and Paroles denied the request. Meanwhile, the state's laws were changing. In 2024, the new governor, Jeff Landry, signed a law allowing the use of nitrogen hypoxia and the electric chair as alternative methods of execution. The victims' families expressed hope that court decisions that had been delayed for decades would finally be carried out. As of 2025, Todd Calvin Vessinger remains on death row in a Louisiana state prison. His execution has not yet been scheduled, but prosecutors continue to seek it. Robert Wayne Sawyer was born in Louisiana in 1951. His childhood was difficult, his family was poor, his relationship with his parents was strained, and Robert himself was quick-tempered and had difficulty controlling himself from an early age. School was difficult for him, and he soon dropped out, earning a living by doing odd jobs. Even as a young man, Sawyer had numerous run-ins with the law, being arrested for fighting and petty theft. By the age of 20, he already had a criminal record for the manslaughter of a 4-year-old child in Arkansas. Despite the severity of the crime, he spent only a year behind bars. After his release, he returned to Louisiana, where he continued to lead a disorderly life. He abused alcohol, often quarreled with friends, and changed jobs one after another. On September 28, 1979, Sawyer was at the home of his acquaintance, Cynthia Shano, in Gretna. With him were her relative, Frances Arwood, and a family friend, Charles Lane. A conflict broke out among those present, which escalated into violence. As a result, Arwood suffered severe injuries and burns. She fell into a coma and died almost 2 months later, on November 21, 1979. Doctors determined that the cause of death was extensive burns and traumatic brain injury. The investigation quickly established that only Sawyer, Lane, and the landlady were in the house at the time of the attack. Both men were arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Lane made a deal with the investigation, pleaded guilty, and received a life sentence. Sawyer, on the other hand, stood trial. The trial took place in Jefferson County. The prosecution presented witness testimony, medical reports, and confessions made by Sawyer after his arrest. According to the prosecution, he played a key role in the events that led to the death of Frances Arwood. The defense attorneys argued that Sawyer was intoxicated and did not realize what he was doing, and also cited mental disorders and possible brain damage sustained in childhood. But the court found these arguments insufficient to mitigate the sentence. The jury found Robert Wayne Sawyer guilty of first-degree murder, and the court sentenced him to death. At the sentencing hearing, prosecutors emphasized his criminal history, including a previous conviction for the death of a child, calling Sawyer a dangerous repeat offender who was beyond rehabilitation. After the sentence was handed down, lawyers filed several appeals, arguing that Sawyer was mentally ill and should not be executed. Medical examinations did reveal signs of organic brain damage, but judges at all levels found that he was aware of his actions at the time of the crime. The appeals process dragged on for more than 10 years. In the end, all appeals were rejected, and the execution was scheduled for March 5, 1993. This date went down in history. Robert Sawyer became the first person in Louisiana to be executed by lethal injection, which replaced the electric chair as the primary method of execution. On the eve of his execution, Sawyer submitted a petition for clemency, stating that he repented and asked for his death sentence to be commuted to life imprisonment. In the letter, he also referred to his mental instability, but the clemency board found no grounds for mitigating the punishment. On the evening of March 5th at 8 p.m., he was given a lethal injection at the Louisiana State Penitentiary, known as Angola. At 42, Robert Wayne Sawyer became the first prisoner to be executed by this method in Louisiana's history.